Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 more of the worst disasters in history. The final story has one of the most brutal incidents I've ever come across, and not because of the scale of the disaster, but instead because of the horrific circumstances the people endured. So as a warning, although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. For many of us, few things conjure up images of hopelessness and despair like Victorian-era asylums, and in many respects, these feelings are well-founded. Conditions in 19th and 20th century mental health institutions were often about as bad as it gets. Interestingly though, in the early 1800s, an innovative English doctor figured out that patients behaved better and led more fulfilling lives when they learned new skills and did meaningful work instead of being confined with nothing to do day after day. This may not be surprising at all today, but this approach proved far more effective than traditional methods, particularly at the Hatch Asylum in Middlesex, England. The construction of the Hatch Asylum began in spring of 1849, and then after more than 2 years of construction, the first patients began arriving in mid-July of 1851. This institution was located on the outskirts of London and was originally meant to house a large portion of the area's pauper insane, or in layman's terms, poor Londoners with debilitating mental health issues. At the time, it was the largest institution of its kind in Europe, and unlike most of its intimidating grey stone contemporaries, it was built in a trendy Italian style. The residential portion of the asylum was surrounded by a typical 2,000-foot-long wall, but with a 75-acre farm, dozens of workshops, and its own brewery and aviary, it looked more like a sprawling country estate than a mental health facility. Inside, patients lived in wards separated by their conditions, their genders, and their propensity to engage in violence and other disruptive behaviors. And to ensure patients had minimal contact with members of other groups, the wards were connected by a network of long corridors that were dotted with guarded iron gates that were usually locked. And while the asylum's interior layout wasn't a huge departure from older designs, its radical new treatment plan definitely was. The new management scheme was largely the result of a man named Dr. John Connolly, who had been the superintendent of the first asylum in the county years before. Back then, he and his staff had remarkable success simply by giving patients meaningful work and letting them go about their business as freely as possible. And most importantly, they were totally unrestrained whenever possible. So instead of spending long days in confinement with nothing to do, patients actually performed important jobs the facility needed to function. And to the surprise of the staff, many men and women experienced significant turnarounds because for the first time, they actually had meaningful work to occupy them. However, unfortunately, despite all these progressive and successful policies, as the local communities grew and demand increased, the facility took on more than twice as many patients as it was initially intended to hold. And unfortunately as well, neither the overworked and undertrained staff nor the aging facility were capable of dealing with the influx of new patients. So, to maintain any semblance of order, staff had to resort to older traditions and restrain and isolate the most unruly patients to prevent all-out chaos. So ironically, the very methods that Dr. Connolly was against had once again become common practice, not out of malice or disregard for the patient's well-being, but out of necessity. In fact, conditions continued to deteriorate, and in some respects, they eventually got worse than what patients experienced at the Hatch's notorious predecessors. By the 1880s, conditions at the institution were so bad that the name became a euphemism for locals to describe anything they found bizarre, irrational, or dark. Then, by 1896, the overcrowding got so out of hand that a temporary wooden structure comprised of 5 wards was built to house more than 300 female patients. This would soon lead to disaster. The air was brisk and the sky over Colney Hatch was grey on the morning of January 27, 1903. Some patients were still in bed at 5:30 a.m., but those with jobs and more than a dozen staff members were already going about their morning routines like they always did. Even at that hour, the wards echoed with creaking beds, shuffling feet, flushing toilets, and the clanging of pots and pans in the large kitchen. As this was all going on, and unbeknownst to everyone inside the women's ward, there was something happening in a dark corner of the attic above them. Natural gas was used for light, heat, and cooking fuel inside the asylum because it was far cleaner and more efficient than coal, but it was also more volatile too. And while it's not entirely odorless, it went undetected because it was obscured by other smells like cooking food and the industrial cleaners used throughout the facility. It's unclear when the leak started or how much gas escaped, but it was ignited by a spark of unknown origin a few minutes before 6 a.m. The gas then instantly morphed into a giant fireball, and the wooden walls, floors, ceiling, as well as the dry bedding in the wards burst into flames in a matter of seconds. Meanwhile, gas continued leaking from the damaged pipe, and outside, the growing inferno gathered even more strength from the stronger than usual winds. When the staff realized that the fire couldn't be contained, they were confronted with the almost impossible task of getting hundreds of ill patients out of the structure and to the courtyard as quickly as possible. Even worse, their only means of exit was through the labyrinth of narrow gated hallways that were designed to inhibit movement in the first place. This was also further complicated by the fact that many of the patients were hiding in their beds or under tables because of the chaos. Others cowered together in corners, paralyzed by fear, and there were a few who were incapable of comprehending the enormity of the situation, and so they just went about their business as if it were another morning. In this chaos, staff members gathered small groups of patients and began leading them through flame and smoke-filled corridors. In many cases, the temperature was so hot and the visibility was so poor they had to turn back and look for alternative routes. And of course, nearly all of these were equally impassable, and as the fire intensified, so did the sound of those trapped inside. Then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't possibly get any worse, a large portion of the roof collapsed. This killed many instantly, and for others, it cut off the last possible route of escape. By then, local fire crews were en route as nearby residents wandered out into the street to watch the huge plumes of smoke billowing into the sky miles away. The first crews to arrive on scene quickly entered the burning asylum, but by then, there was little they could do because much of the structure had fallen in on itself. Additional crews arrived shortly after and began putting out the fire, but the process took far longer than it should have because the heat radiating from the structure prevented them from getting close and the water pressure in their engines wasn't high enough. It would end up taking firefighters more than an hour to extinguish the blaze, and by then, it wasn't clear how many patients were missing or how many had made it to safety. The only way to find out was for investigators and rescuers to begin combing through the wreckage, retrieving those who had passed away and figuring out what had caused the tragedy. Many of the rescuers held handkerchiefs over their noses and mouths, and others stopped regularly to dab tears from their eyes because what they found was so horrifying. Many of the patients were still in their beds, and others were found huddled together as if they sought one another out for comfort in their final moments. Tragically, in the end, 52 were found and taken to a staging area outside the burn zone and covered with sheets where they waited for coroner's assistance to transport them to the morgue. In the aftermath, the public, the press, and officials were understandably outraged when the horrifying details of the incident were printed in newspapers all over the United Kingdom. Understandably as well, they wanted to know how such a tragedy could have occurred in an institution charged with caring for society's most vulnerable. These outcries ultimately led to an in-depth investigation almost immediately after the tragedy, and investigators quickly determined that a leaky gas pipe was at least partly to blame. However, they also concluded that the fire shouldn't have gotten so out of control so quickly, and that the overcrowding, the use of flammable construction materials like wood, non-existent fire safety measures, and inadequate staff training were also to blame. Essentially, it was simply a disaster waiting to happen until that spark finally materialized on the morning of January 27, 1903. If there's any razor-thin silver lining to the story, it's that the asylum was rebuilt and new fire safety measures were implemented to prevent a similar disaster in the future. Reformers and activists also used the incident to lobby for better conditions, more robust staff training, and more humane treatment of patients with mental disorders and disabilities. Conditions at the new asylum were far from perfect, but there's little doubt that the level of safety and overall care were far better than they were before. But obviously, this was little consolation to the victims' loved ones. Large, low-pressure weather systems have always been common during the fall months across the Midwest, Great Plains, and Great Lakes. They usually bring turbulent skies, cold winds, and drastic temperature changes, and when conditions are just right, they can also produce hurricane-force winds, tornadoes, and blizzards. But in most cases, temperatures hover just above the freezing point. This means that most of the moisture in the system falls as rain or wet snow that melts quickly on the relatively warm ground. These storms don't usually cause much damage, and though deaths aren't unheard of, they're generally few and far in between. One of these low-pressure systems slammed into the Midwest in mid-November of 1940, but what made it so unique was that it originated in the Pacific Northwest, nearly 2,000 miles away. Because of this, the storm quickly gathered strength, feeding off the dense, warm air over Washington State and the Pacific Ocean. It was even blamed for destroying the Tacoma Narrows Bridge just northeast of downtown Tacoma, Washington, on the morning of November 7, 1940. At that point, the bridge had only been open for 4 months, and it was the third largest suspension bridge in the world and was widely regarded as an engineering marvel. Due to a flaw in the design though, even though wind speeds were only around 40 miles per hour or 64 kilometers per hour, it twisted, vibrated, and oscillated itself apart before crashing into Puget Sound. Surprisingly, even though it was 1940, this whole thing was captured on video, and the engineering mistake that led to this is still discussed into the present day. Either way though, although the storm wasn't particularly strong at this point, it was a harbinger of far worse things to come as the massive system drifted away from the west coast toward the Midwest. The storm then dumped significant amounts of snow in the Rocky Mountains before settling over Iowa and Minnesota just before sunrise in the morning of Monday, November 11th, 1940. That morning, residents woke up to gray skies as far as the eye could see, but temperatures across the region were unseasonably warm. In fact, in some areas, they climbed to nearly 65 Fahrenheit or 18 Celsius by mid-morning. This was a pleasant surprise because many families were on holiday for Armistice Day, or Veterans Day as it's now known. If not for the surprisingly good weather, most people likely would have stayed indoors, but instead they headed out to visit friends and do a few days of outdoor activities like hunting before the winter weather set in for good. This was especially true for duck hunters who set out in record numbers for their camouflage hunting huts all along the Mississippi River from Minnesota all the way to Arkansas. Most of them were appropriately dressed for the warm weather, and the ducks were so plentiful that nothing else seemed to matter. In fact, the sky was filled with more ducks than anyone had ever seen. The hunters didn't know it at the time, but the ducks had sensed the impending storm and were fleeing the area. As the hunters enjoyed this once-in-a-lifetime event, the conditions began worsening and continued to deteriorate throughout the day. In some areas, locals reported that the temperature dropped by as much as 50 Fahrenheit in less than an hour. And by that afternoon, wind gusts exceeding 80 miles per hour were being reported all over the region. But even then, the weather wasn't necessarily cause for concern. It wasn't anything that most people hadn't experienced before, at least initially. But that changed when reports of heavy thunderstorms, tornadoes, hurricane-force winds, and ultra-low pressure cells began pouring into the National Weather Service office in Chicago. By then, the massive front stretched all the way from the Canadian border in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south, and from Idaho and Colorado in the west to New York and Pennsylvania in the east. In the north as well, the front fed off cold Arctic air sweeping across Canada, and from the south it gathered strength from the warm, moist air over the Gulf states and the Gulf of Mexico. So, by then, with two nearly inexhaustible sources of energy, the stage was set for a winter storm of epic proportions. As this was going on, national meteorologists suspected that something serious was going on in the atmosphere and that they weren't dealing with just another run-of-the-mill low-pressure system. At the time though, technology, communication, and meteorology were not what they are today, and they failed to recognize the full magnitude of the situation. This was partly because, unlike today, they couldn't rely on satellite images or advanced computers capable of predicting where storms would form, which direction they'd take, and what kind of damage they'd cause before dying off. In addition, the National Weather Service was far more centralized back then than it is now, and offices were generally only open between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Worse yet, meteorologists in regional Midwest offices relied largely on information provided by the main office in Chicago. Reports also generally contained little more than temperature, wind, and barometric readings, and if something big happened after 8 p.m., the other offices rarely heard about it before the following morning. And in fact, on November 9th and 10th, meteorologists in Chicago did alert smaller regional offices that a storm was approaching, but the messages weren't any more dire than the hundreds of others they'd received over the years. So when the snow finally started to fall on the morning of November 11th, it didn't let up for nearly an entire day. Some areas received nearly 2 feet of snow and ice in a matter of hours, and snowdrifts nearly 20 feet deep engulfed everything from cars and power lines to homes and businesses. Some residents who were out and about managed to make it back to their homes, but many got stuck on impassable roads in whiteout conditions. In some cases, visibility was so poor that drivers couldn't even see the hood ornaments just a few feet in front of their windshields. Many then decided to ride out the storm in their vehicles because they realized that wandering off in the storm would be a death sentence. They then simply pulled over, switched on their four-way flashers, bundled up in whatever they had on hand, and prayed that their engines wouldn't freeze up before they died of exposure. But unfortunately, back in the 1940s, car heaters were not what they are today, and even in their vehicles, the air was so cold and full of moisture that people claimed that each inhalation felt like someone was pouring water down their throats and into their lungs. And unsurprisingly, it was even worse for those who abandoned their vehicles in cities, towns, and rural areas all over the region. Many of those who tried to walk got lost and froze to death, and despite the chaos, there was almost nothing emergency personnel could do. Nearly all of the roads were closed and communication ground to a halt because hundreds of telephone lines had been toppled by wind and the sheer weight of ice and snow clinging to them. On the Mississippi River, many duck hunters decided to hunker down in their huts because they thought the storm would pass in an hour or two. And again, most were inadequately dressed because the weather had been so warm when they left home that morning. So, of these, many froze to death where they were. By early afternoon, many others realized they had to make a break for it while they still had a fighting chance. By then, though, the wind chill was well below freezing and visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Many fleeing hunters then got lost in the whiteout conditions and fell where they were or drowned crossing creeks in last-ditch efforts to get back to their vehicles. It's not clear how many duck hunters were lost, but some estimates put the number at more than 4 dozen. In the end, the Armistice Day blizzard was the single worst hunting disaster in American history, and incredibly, there might have been far more casualties if not for the heroic actions of Minnesota pilots Max Conrad and John Bean. They risked their own lives flying light aircraft up and down the Mississippi River looking for survivors and dropping supplies to sustain them until rescuers on the ground could get to them. In another area in Watkins, Minnesota, 2 lives were lost when 2 trains had a head-on collision in the blinding snow. And even more passengers may have died after the accident had it not been for the town's residents who converged on the crash site and led the survivors to safety using literal human chains because visibility was so poor. Meanwhile, elsewhere, 3 freighters sank and 64 lives were lost in Lake Michigan as waves crested at nearly 40 feet or 12 meters and wind gusts topped 100 miles per hour or 160 kilometers per hour. All told, the storm caused more than $50 million in damage and was responsible for 154 deaths, though some suspect the actual numbers may be far higher. In the wake of the disaster, the National Weather Service was heavily criticized for failing to predict just how big and destructive the storm would be. In response, officials claimed that the storm didn't catch them off guard entirely, but they also admitted that they severely underestimated the magnitude. This disaster would lead to round-the-clock monitoring and analysis and much-needed decentralization. And as a result, regional offices became far more autonomous, had more access to vital data, and were permitted to make emergency warnings. This allowed them to make more timely decisions without having to go through so much red tape, all of which made the National Weather Service far more efficient and effective. In the early morning hours of August 11, 1965, the sound of the road underneath a bus traveling along Turkey's D100 highway had lulled many of the 40 passengers aboard to sleep. During the previous evening, the bus departed Ankara for a 350-kilometer westbound trip to Istanbul, which is the country's capital city. As the passengers rested just after 3 a.m., the driver Özdemir guided the bus into the Hendek district of one of the provinces, which is an area that's home to more than 1 million people today, located along the coast of the Black Sea. As they approached a village around 3:15 a.m., the highway was pitch black when Özdemir finally saw what was ahead of him. Parked in the road, just coming into the view of the headlights, was a tanker truck that had become disabled by a mechanical issue, but by the time he saw it, it was already too late. Özdemir then slammed on the brakes, hoping to stop the bus before it slammed into the tanker, but a collision was inevitable. The only question was how bad it would be. Fortunately, the brakes did their part in slowing the speeding bus down to the point where the impact wasn't even enough to wake all the sleeping passengers. Damage to the bus was also fortunately minimal, and none of those aboard were even injured. It appeared at first glance that a complete disaster was averted, but the parked truck didn't fare nearly as well. The impact of the accident was enough to cause the truck's tanker to spill its hull all over the highway, and this was a significant problem no one in the bus could have imagined. This is because the truck was carrying a full tank of nitric acid, which is a colorless liquid most often used in the production of fertilizers and explosives. Nitric acid is highly toxic and corrosive and can come in varying concentrations, but most often the commercially available solution is about 32% water. The nitric acid inside the truck's tanker, however, was less than 10% water, putting the load in a category of chemicals that causes fuming. These fumes can cause respiratory problems if inhaled, which can be severe enough to cause pulmonary edema, which is where fluid fills the lungs. That, however, is next to nothing compared to what happens if nitric acid comes in contact with your skin. It's a highly corrosive chemical that will cause severe, agonizing burns, and it was all over the highway. Running along the road was a ditch that contained water, and as the nitric acid spilled out over the asphalt, it ran down into the ditch and mixed with the water. In almost an instant, this filled the air with a thick white smoke that quickly infiltrated the bus. The noxious fumes were then more than enough to awaken the passengers, and the first thing they saw when they opened their eyes was this smoke. Chaos inside then immediately broke out as passengers believed the bus was on fire. This then caused a stampede toward the front door of the bus as people desperately tried to escape. Thankfully though, while it was a completely chaotic exit, everyone aboard managed to get out of the bus, but this only brought about their next, more horrifying ordeal. As the passengers collected along the roadside, away from the growing smoke, they all began to feel the searing pain of nitric acid that had splashed onto their skin when they stepped off the bus. Panic then ensued as this became more and more intense. One of the passengers then spotted a small pit of liquid in the roadside ditch and sought the relief of washing whatever it was off his skin. And because nitric acid looks exactly like water, no one could have known that the fluid in the ditch wasn't just harmless rain runoff from the highway. Instead, it had become mostly a vat of acid from the tanker. The passenger then desperately leapt into the ditch, completely submerging himself in the spilled liquid, and seeing this, others followed behind him. Within seconds, everyone who jumped into the ditch began to literally melt. The acid then immediately ate through everything all the way down to the bone. As this happened, the chaos was even greater than before, but soon it was quiet as many of the 23 passengers who jumped literally disintegrated on that roadside. Those who didn't seek false refuge in the ditch weren't in much better shape though. Ozdemir, the 7 remaining passengers, and the truck driver all suffered injuries of varying severity, but one thing was common among all of them: the intense, unimaginable searing. And while there's no such thing as pure nitric acid, since water is needed in the production of the liquid, the concentration of the nitric acid in the tanker was so high that even a few drops in exposed skin would cause the feeling to be intense and constant. As word of the accident got out, people from the nearby village and soldiers from a nearby battalion responded and transported the injured to the closest hospital. And within moments of arriving, the hospital was consumed with both the scent and sound as doctors worked to neutralize the effect of the acid. Sometime later, and after a 6-hour battle for his life, the truck driver died at the hospital, and 7 more passengers succumbed to their wounds. Those who survived did so only to endure more. Even days after the accident, the experience was so bad that survivors would often beg hospital staff to relieve them the only way they knew was a sure thing. Passengers would go on to lose eyes, feet, and hands, and the lucky ones who got to keep all of their appendages were still scarred for life. Of the 40 passengers and 2 drivers involved in the accident, only 9 people, including Ozdemir, would survive what began as a mere fender bender. Back at the scene on the highway, there was very little left of some of the passengers who leapt into the ditch. All that remained of some were parts, and others were reduced to just a few fragments as the only evidence that they were ever alive in the first place. In the aftermath, just 30 feet or 10 meters from where the accident took place, the villagers dug a grave and placed all the remains inside before covering them with dirt. Today, there is a large memorial tomb that lies on top of the grave to commemorate the lives that were lost on the morning of August 11th, 1965. When the accident occurred, the bus was only about 50 miles or 80 kilometers from its final destination. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. Before we end today's video, I have something I want to tell you all about. I don't think I've ever mentioned on the channel before, but my post-secondary schooling was in an entirely unrelated field to YouTube. It was actually in exercise science with a focus on public health, and although I ultimately fell into YouTube and decided not to continue in the field, health promotion is something I still feel strongly about. So today, I want to introduce you to Smart Fitness Remote Training. Smart Fitness is a strength conditioning company that works with both in-person clients locally and online clients from across the world, including national-level powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters, high-performance athletes, teams, youth athletes, and maybe most importantly, people simply wanting to lose weight, get in better shape, or improve their health. It starts with a free video call, which will include a full assessment of your training history, injury history, goals, and a walkthrough of what your program is like. From there, you'll be given a fully customized training program to meet your ability level, goals, and the equipment you have available. This could be just learning the basics if you're a beginner, or advanced power and plyometrics exercises if you're a high-performance athlete. Smart Fitness also includes access to a video library filled with hundreds of videos to learn every movement in the program. So, whether you just want to improve your health and don't know where to start, or you're a high-performance sport or barbell athlete looking to take your training to the next level, I highly recommend you check out Smart Fitness using the link in the description below and use code SCARY20 to get 20% off your first month of coaching. And importantly, I also want to mention that this is not a paid promotion. This is simply a great service run by a great company for a cause I believe in, which is living a healthier, more active lifestyle. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.